Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Chocolate Life Live for December 31st, 2021. My guest today is Carli of Nima Hunter, and we're going to be discussing ESG reporting and sustainability reporting and what it means. So after a quick intro, we'll be back.
The reason I was asking about who's listening and where they are in that value chain, if you will, or value network, is how you would use knowledge about ESG criteria or sustainability concepts and criteria in your business. I mean, what would you be thinking about? Okay, to the extent that one of my consumers, if I'm B2C, or one of my buyers, if I'm B2B, factors ESG metrics or sustainability criteria into their purchasing decision, I would have different ways of looking at what I would need to do in my own organization in terms of how I make purchasing decisions, how I operate my business, and how I present my brand or brands to my audiences. Because there are just so many dimensions to these two concepts that you have to choose from. You can't do it all.
So good afternoon to everyone who's watching live. And if you're not watching live, whatever time of day or night it happens to be that you're watching this, I want to thank my special guest today, Carli, on New Year's Eve. I'm here in New York for joining us and talking about ESG, so environmental, sustainable, or social and governance reporting and sustainability reporting, and about this idea of what can we do, or what should we be doing?
You can't do everything, but you can do something.
We can't do everything, and so from a business perspective, what is it that makes sense for us to do? But I want to start off today is we had an interesting part of our conversation when we got together earlier this week when that snippet of interview that I put into the trailer was we talked. I think that there's a sense in which many of us believe that sustainability is a new thing. But, one of the things we talked about is that this is something that you've been working on in your career in one form or another for what, 25 or 25, 30 years or something like that.
25 years.
Can you talk about, what sparked your interest and what were some of the common challenges then that we still find today?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think it goes back to my days in college when, the first Earth Day occurred and, we were reading the whole Earth catalog, thinking about things more systemically. Right? So I'm a product of a good liberal arts education at St. Lawrence University in upstate New York, and we learned to learn. We were guided in looking at the world systemically as interrelated, and sustainability or sustainable development. Its origins formally begin in the late 80s with the World Commission on Environment and Development. And that group, supported by the United Nations, published a report called Our Common Future. It's often referred to as the Brundtland Report. And the Brundtland Report defined this concept called sustainable development. as development, meaning human activity, that meets the need of the present or the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to do the same, to meet their own needs. So broadly, you could say, sustainability or sustainable development, it encompasses all the environmental, social, and financial aspects of human activity and frankly, of life itself. I mean, it's about, maintaining Earth systems, kind of going back to the whole Earth catalog, right?
Right.
Sustainability today is what we usually refer to it as. Sustainable development was looked at more in the context of the United Nations, and which was later more formally addressed in the development of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and enumerated in 169 very specific targets that all of the member states agreed they're going to achieve by the year 2030. So that's sustainability or sustainable development writ large. Okay. I really wasn't aware of it until I had done some work. My background is in doing research. I've always conducted strategic planning and research for a variety of companies. And at the time, I was working for the CEO of a Swiss company called Greytag, Dr. Hans Rudolf Zuliger, who's a physicist, an entrepreneur, a researcher. He's the author of actually an immersive experience called A Walk Through Time, which there is a link to, I'll put up on the website. And he's written a book, which is called Gaia's Legacy, a plea for an integral worldview. He was the CEO of a company that produced color measurement instruments, something that actually have a relevance to cocoa and chocolate, right? As you start thinking about how can I define it in terms of what it looks like. And he was the one who, he made a fortune. I had a small part in helping him identify a market for his company to roll up. And he acquired a group of companies, took his company public, and made a significant fortune. And over dinner after it was done, he was thanking me for the work I did and complaining, frankly, about how difficult it was for him to now invest this fortune in a manner that was sustainable. And I think that was the first time I'd ever really heard the term sustainable investing, which relates to our more to the issue of ESG, which is about investing fundamentally. And it went right over my head the first time I met with him. And a year later, I came back and had another meeting with him and asked him, so Hans, did you ever resolve your dilemma? Did you ever find a banker who would apply these principles of sustainability or sustainable development to your decisions about what goes in your portfolio? And he said, no, we couldn't. So we've created our own. And I joined together with a group of other high net worth individuals in Switzerland and created a framework of what was called a quantitative inclusive screen, a way of quantitatively assessing companies based on their environmental, social, and financial performance to select who should be in their index or portfolio. So kind of like the Dow Jones Index is an index of companies. Fiduciary rules don't allow a investment advisor to exclude a company qualitatively. So there previously, sustainable investing, or I say ethical investing, was based on eliminating companies from a portfolio. No tobacco, no guns, no whatever. So it was exclusionary, qualitatively exclusionary. This was different. It said, no, we won't exclude any company based on what industry they're in. If they're in the Dow index, we'll include them. However, we'll select from that the most sustainable, meaning those companies that have the best performance that we can determine based on responses to questions we present them with about their environmental activities and performance, or their goals and their social and their governance activities. And so that portfolio, that method, actually wound up becoming the basis for the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. They merged that concept, that rubric for evaluating what goes in a portfolio, and that became the Dow Jones Sustainability Index. And The
And
light went on.
if I can
Yeah.
interrupt, when did the Dow Jones include the sustainability index? So
That was in the 90s. Well, let's
okay,
see. The first, I guess, I was in the mid 90s, I believe.
okay,
The first formal framework or standard for reporting on sustainability, which was some attempt to codify these principles of environmental, social, and financial analysis, was the Global Reporting Index. And their first standard was issued in the year 2000. So until the year 2000, there was no formal standard that one could evaluate a company's performance against. And that standard was developed, again, with the assistance of the United Nations Environmental Program and two nonprofits. There was a nonprofit called CERES, the Coalition for Environmentally Responsible Economies, and the TELUS Institute, back in like 1997. And it had become very broadly adopted. And a number of rating agencies and indexes emerged in the years subsequent. Right? So you would see companies publishing sustainability reports or corporate social responsibility reports, and they would often describe their performance and their goals in terms of the Global Reporting Initiative standard. And back to our, starting conversation about what matters and what you can do. You can't do everything, but you can do something. And the question is, what's material? What matters? What matters to your stakeholders? And in the context of sustainability reporting, the stakeholders that have been given priority have been investors. Other stakeholders include your employees, the communities in which the members of the communities in which you operate, even future generations are considered stakeholders, right? So sustainable development from a United Nations and Sustainable Development perspective looks at all stakeholders, all life itself, all forms of life that support our form of life, and ESG, environmental social governance reporting, is a subset of that. That looks at primarily the impact of risks that grow out of environmental, social, and financial dimensions of human activity that could impact the value of the shares in a company to its investors.
Okay, so we're looking at ESG reporting primarily from a fiduciary sense.
Yeah. So it's an attempt to codify a consensus standards-based set of KPIs, key performance indicators or factors, and materiality constructs. Because for each industry, what's material differs. For the steel industry, what's material is different from
for cocoa and chocolate,
right,
what is different? Because fundamentally agricultural as opposed to, for example, mining.
Right. Yeah. And it's a function of looking at the full value chain or value network of an industry to say, who are the stakeholders, broadly spoken, how important to the investors' value, shareholder value, are the impacts of our activities on those stakeholders, and to what degree are risks there potentially going to impact our share value. So when going back to Dr. Zuliger, what he impressed on me, the light that went on for me, was that he had hired Richard Sandor, who is a noted economist who developed the Chicago Carbon Exchange back in the days when carbon credits and carbon trading were really nascent concepts. And they had developed a backcasting model where they took the performance of stocks historically and they ran their portfolio screen, their quantitative screen, on what had already happened to see if they had used that screen, would the portfolio have performed better? Would the value of the portfolio have been greater? And another key indicator was, to what extent did sustainability analysis, taking into account these non-financial aspects of a company's performance and activities, was it kind of a new IQ test for management because they were doing a better job of identifying risk and therefore reducing the volatility in the stock. So they were also not only looking at share price performance, but they were looking at the volatility of share price. Because if there's one thing that markets hate, it's chaos, it's uncertainty, it's volatility.
Well, bringing this back closer to the topic of what's going on. So again, this reporting is all about investment. So how do we quantify risks associated with investing in particular kinds of areas and determining who stakeholders are in this whole process. So we have, on one hand, ESG reporting. On the other hand, we have what we think of as sustainability reporting, which is contextually based in the conversations.
They're both contextual, but the context is different.
So can we talk about those differences? How do we put together? So I think when most people think about sustainability, right? If I'm a consumer, I'm not actually an investor. Right. What I'm thinking about is I'm thinking about
retail investor. So there are a lot of Robinhood fans.
Well, that's very true. But thinking about cocoa and chocolate, and thinking about sort of small to medium sized enterprises. So whether somebody who's processing, for example, somewhere between 1 and 10 tons of cocoa beans a year to somebody who's processing 250 tons of cocoa beans a year, these people want to make sustainability claims. Right.
Well, that's a different issue. So
right. Claims, I think that when we talk about what matters, right, a lot of what matters will depend upon, am I a publicly traded company? Right. And so I have a very different set of concerns.
That does make a difference.
Right.
Or it depends on where you are in the world.
And where I'm in the world. And, in my and literally, in this case, literally a small business.
Yeah. So, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No. And I'm sort of, one of the things that I want to do, I did very, very quickly, is I brought up, and the link of this will be on the Chocolate Life, I brought up, what the EU taxonomy is when it comes to ESG reporting, and what the 6 primary factors that are governed in ESG reporting. And so, again, for everybody who's watching, you can go to thechocolatelife.com. There will be a link to this page on the website. And then I also found, the compass, which enables me to go in and look at particular economic areas and particular industries and decide what it is that's what may be relevant to me or what I need to think about. And so, Don, I suppose the question is, again, bringing it to what matters is how do I go about navigating these kinds of things? If again.
Well, for me, it's it's always been identifying and hopefully engaging mentors and advisors who are willing to share their perspective, because it does require perspective. For example, Dr. Zuliger was very helpful to me in making sense of what sustainability was and how it mattered to me and how I could bring it to my business practice. In other words, in my engagements with companies I consulted to, like Xerox, how could I use what I knew about sustainability to have a meaningful conversation with the CEO of the company about how it should impact strategy and how it should impact, the operational aspects of the business and the way in which the business communicates. And those are 3 different things, right? There's strategy. It's not only what should we do, but what can we do? Then it's how do we do it? Once we've decided it's strategically relevant. And finally, it's how do we talk about it? How do we communicate it? I think what we find right now is there are no less than 24 standards or frameworks that address sustainability reporting or ESG reporting. And they vary based on where you are in the world. In the US, for example, there's the US SEC, which is currently in the process of formulating mandatory ESG reporting standards. They have not yet been formulated. So that's a debate, a raging debate that's going on right now. There are some fairly conservative members of the SEC who are pushing back against it. Actually, one of them making an editorial presentation about chocolate covers cicadas. So that's a chocolate connection. We can take that up later. In the EU, you do have the EU taxonomy, and that is imposing mandatory disclosure obligations on companies. And in the US and internationally, when it comes to ESG reporting, you have a grand alliance that's beginning to form. And I'll give you it's an acronym soup. So,
that it is.
Yeah. So don't be overwhelmed. The first thing I'll tell you as a takeaway, one is don't be overwhelmed by the acronyms. But they're coming together in a group generally looked at as the Value Reporting Foundation, and the acronym is ISSB, which stands for the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is in adopted support of the sustainability, what's called SASB, the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. IOSCO, which is the International Organization of Security Commissions, which, like the SEC, which the accounting industry is very much aligned with, and as well as the IFRS, it's the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation. So these groups are coming together. They have not yet arrived at their conclusion, but they are actively in the process of developing a unified framework for ESG reporting. And there are debates as well. Is it based on GAAP accounting, which is broadly adopted and accepted in the United States, or non-GAAP accounting? That could create some tension. There's also a group that Michael Bloomberg and Bloomberg Philanthropies have headed up, which has gotten a lot of traction in recent years, called the TCFD, which is, again, another reporting standard primarily focused on climate impacts. So there's sustainability writ large, which takes into account all kinds of things like biodiversity loss and slavery and child slavery and so on. And then there's just climate, like net zero commitments and the 1.5 degree targets, right? Much of what is taking place in ESG reporting at present is very focused on the climate risks to shareholder value. In other words, climate change related risks to shareholder value. And critics would say it's myopic, it's narrow, it's not systemic enough. We need to take into account other stakeholders and other aspects and impacts of human activity and business, and more importantly, corporate activity that could, in effect, imperil, pass some threshold, which is irreversible, and violate that first principle of, allowing future generations to meet their needs.
Yeah. So if I can, what I want to do is, there is a time frame. So what we're looking at is, we're looking at somewhere in the next 1 to 5 years, where this is, or even
2030
faster.
was the SDG goals have a 2030 clock on them.
Right.
And, the net zero commitments, we may be generously saying it's 2025 or 2030, but the reality is, even at the current level of climate change warming, right, we're already seeing effects. 1.5 is not better than where we are now. It's less bad than where we will be if it reaches 2 or 3 degrees.
Right. And so this is certainly a conversation we have, better is better than perfect, doing something is better than nothing, right? Moving in a direction.
Let's not let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but let's not satisfy for just making things less bad, because in effect, there are things we can do to make things better from a sustainable development perspective across all 17 of the dimensions of sustainable development or sustainability.
Right. So let's say I'm a small chocolate company, right? I'm not going to worry about what small means at the moment, but
say less than a publicly traded company.
Less than a publicly traded company, somewhere between $1 million a year and $500 million a year, which is
I think the public-private distinction is a good line of demarcation.
Okay, so what I want to get to the notion is that as a chocolate maker, there are some rules and regulations that I need to follow. So there are some food and safety regulations. There are some traceability regulations, especially the Food Safety Modernization Act.
Those are table stakes. You don't have a choice.
Don't have a choice. But if I'm a chocolate maker, one of the things that may happen as a result of these reporting standards is that I'm going to need to hold my suppliers, right, to a certain level of reporting. And then what will happen in turn is that my customers, so if I'm trying to sell into Whole Foods, for example, as opposed to taking things down to the local farmer's market, I have a very, very different, Or do, I mean,
it breaks out in two ways.
Yeah.
One is reporting. So one has to do with what has to be reported. And if we think about it, mandatory disclosure obligations, regulatory requirements are the baseline for everybody. Below that, you're bad. Okay?
Right.
Below that line is bad. At that line is kind of good enough. The question is, how do I do better than that? What can I do? And then how do I communicate it? And if there's a disparity between what I communicate and what I do, that's a risk. The risk is what I call the fishbowl world risk. It's the pink slime moment risk. It's what happens when, in a world with billions of smartphones, you're one Snapchat, TikTok post away from brand image risk disaster. That's all it takes. And it's about perception. It's not necessarily about reality at that point as well. So the small brand has to think about, what do I do to be better in a way that's meaningfully different from the other brands I compete with for consumer decisions? And how transparent and how authentic, consistent am I in presenting what I'm doing that's better in my communications, in my brand? And so it's not just, it's not just the tagline, it's not just the slogan or the jingle, it's the totality of that brand's positioning and the way it expresses that positioning. And if they're consistent, and if that difference is meaningful to the people who value their brand, it's a different thing than reporting, as we think about it in the case of large companies that produce 50-page ESG reports with a table of indicators, KPIs, against a set of metrics like the TCFD or SASB requirements.
Well, there are a lot of smaller chocolate companies. I mean, smaller in the grand scheme of things, but we have companies like Dandelion and Taza, Uncommon Cacao, who is a broker, not a chocolate maker, who produce what are called transparency reports. And the idea is that if I, number one is, if I'm a chocolate maker, I use this transparency report to document the good that I have done over the course of the last year. And Uncommon Cacao is providing information that their customers can use to support claims about, ethical sourcing and more sustainable sourcing and things like that. And I, the question I have is, again, not everybody has the resources to be able to do this kind of reporting. And so I think, navigating.
Let's just assume they don't have the resources.
Right. So how, what is assuming you don't have the resources, right? How do you go about navigating this alphabet soup, which is associated with?
I know a great deal more about the cacao and chocolate industries than I do. I'm a generalist. I'm not a narrow specialist in that regard. But in other industries, it often falls to industry associations or coalitions of brands who are not necessarily about the race to the bottom. The most big associations tend to have a very difficult time doing anything aspirational, because you always have to be satisfying the least aspirational of your members, who tends to be the biggest. But they do get together and sometimes say, look, we're going to create a pledge. We're going to create a commitment that goes beyond good, that is about better in some dimension, whether that's child slavery, whether that's ethical sourcing. We're going to come up with a rubric, a set of things that we say we can be measured against. And in the best of cases, they submit themselves to independent verification of their performance against those criteria. And one way that could be done using standards like the ISO standards, various ISO standards, International Standards Organization, which are consensus standards, are environmental product declarations, which take the form of what looks very much like the nutrition label we're accustomed to seeing as consumers, right? But it uses the disciplines of life cycle analysis that looks at the full scope of factors that should be considered in the product. So the product is the tip of the iceberg. The question is, where did the energy that was used to make it come from? How much water was used? What labor was employed? So some of it is environmental. Those are environmental product disclosures. More fully, you can have comparable disclosures about other factors such as anti-slavery or child labor, et cetera. And there are accountability standards as well. And there are third-party verification entities that, like SAI Global, SGS, that if you give them a protocol, if you give them a standard, and you say, independently, your auditors can go and audit our performance against this standard, that's one of the devices that can be used. Other than that, it's basically the wild, wild west of say something, trust me, please, and I'll just hope I don't get caught at it. Caught in the lie, right?
Right. So, again, so to what extent does the EU taxonomy and things like that, how are they going to affect, the quote unquote standards, if I can call them that in cocoa and chocolate, people seem to think about? So they think about fair trade certified, and they think about Rainforest Alliance / UTZ certification.
Sure.
So are what we're going to see is we're going to see a convergence of these different kinds of quote unquote voluntary standards. So, Rainforest Alliance has said, this is what we care about. We're going to audit against the things we care about.
Yeah.
And then, you have fair trade says, these are the things we care about. We're going to audit against them. Right? Do we see a convergence of those things, or
I see some things converging? As the example I gave of the value reporting framework, that is a convergence of competing standards who finally said, "Hey, you know what? This is creating more chaos than clarity. So let's see if we can get together." And we have the same kind of thing taking place in the world of ESG rating agencies. So when ESG became so popular and it didn't have standards, a whole industry of ESG rating firms like MCSI and ISS and Sustainalytics emerged, primarily, again, looking at investors who say, I want to pick a stock. Can you give me an index or rating that I can just use to make my decision simple? Because I don't have time to go all through this. Right. Even there, they are coming under scrutiny saying, guys, you're using rubber rulers and we need to start standardizing how you do your analysis. So the good news is, from a climate change perspective, climate change risk perspective, I think there'll be some things that even small businesses can take advantage of, use in communicating climate risk, net zero commitment, compliance, et cetera. But no, I don't see a grand convergence being possible. And there are always going to be proprietary or consortia-based rubrics that'll be or labels that'll emerge to slap on a group of products or a type of product to say it's better in some way, trust us. Right. And then it comes down to credibility support.
Right. So one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation is I was in the middle of writing an article for International Confectionery Magazine about ethical cocoa sourcing. And it occurred to me that, before we could even start about, how to go about sourcing cocoa ethically, we need to decide what we mean by the term ethical.
Yeah.
So, I had this notion, it's not new to me, it's not original to me, but, beliefs inform actions and actions have consequences. What we believe is based on the words we use, the language we use, when we say a word, what we mean when we say it. Right. And therefore the words we choose to use have consequences. And this question, for example, just really, really briefly here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, this is a link that you sent to me. It's in today's, it's in the article for today's live stream. And oh, by the way, if you're watching it, you have a comment for Don, you have a question for Don, you'd like to share it, just put it down in the comments,
Yeah.
whether you're watching on YouTube or Facebook or LinkedIn. We'll see it here and we can respond to it. And while you're at it, if you're watching it on YouTube especially, please like the video. I would appreciate that. But what I'm showing you, Don, is something from a group called the Climate Justice Alliance. And they have this analysis framework and strategy. And if you're watching this, don't worry about trying to make sense of it here. You'll be able to look at this because the link is in today's post on this. But it's really interesting that they're using a pair of words that I think is interesting, which is extractive, what I think of as extractive economics, which I characterize as more sort of Milton Friedman, Chicago school, profit is everything.
Yeah, otherwise looked at as the make, take, and waste economy.
Right. Well, and I think that, for me, one of the things which is interesting about this is it's about, we're going to try to externalize many, many things. So, if I don't have to account for, the pollution that I generate downstream,
sure,
right, then it's extractive. I mean, as opposed to regenerative in the source of regenerative agriculture. So the notion of regenerative agriculture
sure,
is that you leave enough behind in the system.
The origins of that are actually in forestry. I mean, the term sustainability that we use is actually based on a forestry term that refers to felling only as much timber as you can fell to allow it to grow back. Right. So the regenerative economy could be thought of as the very popular notion these days is the circular economy. That's the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, Dame Ellen MacArthur, has been very successful in communicating this notion of the circular economy and circularity that is having a big impact in the packaged goods industry. Again, we think about the cocoa, we often don't think about the packaging, but much of the packaging that's employed in food is plastic. And those
single-use
plastics at that, or even more importantly, what are called multi-layer plastics that are not currently recyclable, and because you can't rip them apart easily. The various laminate components that we create to block airflow, right? We don't want permeability, so we create multi-layer plastics.
Right. I had an interesting conversation 2 weeks ago with Carolina Pozo of Muse Cacao in Ecuador. And she says one of the things that they've done over the course of the last couple of years is they've developed out of sugarcane waste, using bagasse from sugarcane. They've developed a paper which has got barrier properties, which are sufficient to make it usable in packaging concepts without requiring multi-layer plastic.
Yeah, there are a number of associations and industry consortia that have formed. One is to advance circular economy concepts related to plastic and packaging. Again, there too, there's an enormous juggernaut in the form of the global petrochemical industry that does a good job of selling concepts that might not be all as circular as people would like to think. Their premise is let's just take all the waste, instead of trying to sort it, let's just gasify it and turn it back into its fundamental molecules and atoms, and then we'll reconstitute those as new plastic. But in large part, the criticism is that these efforts to use what are called chemical recycling and to produce blue ammonia and blue hydrogen and blue or green methanol as precursor chemicals and energy sources will perpetuate the extractive industries, right? As opposed to saying, well, let's just stop doing that. The argument that's made very often is we're going to be, if you don't include us in the transition from an extractive economy to a regenerative economy, the currently available renewable technologies for materials and energy will be insufficient to meet the needs of society in the interim. Right. And so you will experience shortages, you will experience chaos, and you will experience runaway inflation. So if you don't include us and give us the funding we ask for to build new infrastructure and to support what are called transition sources, like, is natural gas a transition to renewable energy sources? Natural gas industry would argue, yes, we need it. It's better than coal. So not worse than.
That's true, but is a shift to natural gas prolonging something that which needs fundamental change?
And so there, that debate is going to continue to rage. And we're I think we're in a different position today is, especially coming out of this COP26 that took place in Glasgow, the Conference of the Parties. A couple of important things changed. One is the parties have now agreed to meet annually instead of every 5 years. That's a big thing.
Absolutely.
Right? The second thing is, until COP26, pledges were made for sometimes hundreds of billions of dollars, which were not met. And the realization was arrived at that hundreds of billions of dollars is actually grossly inadequate to address the existential threat of climate change alone. That for that, we're going to need hundreds of trillions of dollars. And a grand coalition of private investment funds, insurers, et cetera, was formed at COP26 called the GFANZ Alliance.
The Global Financial Alliance for Net Zero?
That's correct. Cool. And said, in order for us to achieve the 1.5 degree, or be on, I shouldn't say achieve, to be on track to achieve, notice the diplomatic language, to achieve the 1.5 degree goal and net zero commitments, we will commit $130 trillion of private capital to infrastructure investment to support a just transition.
Okay.
Now, just the debate is still, again, what is just? Who's it just for? What constitutes justice for a given stakeholder group? Where I think cocoa is rather interesting, and chocolate is it's so highly dependent on the economies and peoples of the equatorial region of the planet. And while cocoa and chocolate might not be as big an industry as some others that get a lot of attention, it's kind of a bellwether industry. It's an emotionally relevant industry.
Well, I think this is something that I think is overlooked in the discussion. Again, the cocoa industry is about 10 billion a year.
Yeah,
Chocolate's about 100
round off
billion.
error. Yeah.
I mean, when you compare it with oil or with crops, you compare it with
agricultural
corn
overall,
or soybeans or things like that. I mean, it is minuscule.
Or paper or printing.
All of these things.
Yeah.
But people form different kinds of emotional relationships with soybeans than they do with chocolate. Again, probably cultural, and that's another thing which came out of an article that I wrote back this summer, was that when we talk about sustainability, when we're talking to, for example, people in European as opposed to United States locations, that in Europe sustainability discussions are better received if they're couched in terms of social justice, whereas in the US, we tend to think about things in terms of recyclability. And before you jump in, I want to say thank you very much to Thomas Forbes. Tom's been, a longtime supporter of the Chocolate Life, was in almost every single one of the 143 Clubhouse episodes. And he's out walking along the Atlantic City Boardwalk today. And so thanks.
Let's
Thomas,
take some
for
questions. I'm interested in what people people want to know instead of I can go on.
Absolutely. If you're watching now and you have a question for either Donald or myself about this topic, especially if you're involved in the chocolate business, please let us know, and I will get that question up on stage and talk about it. Yeah. But Don, I interrupted. This question about language.
The importance of narrative
here is as a communicator. As somebody who tries to tell stories about cocoa and chocolate and tell them in a way that gets people to change. Language is a really, really interesting
Yeah,
topic.
language and imagery. I think that it's kind of interesting to reflect on it from a communications perspective.
Mm-hmm.
ESG reporting is highly quantitative. It's asking you how many tons of greenhouse gas emissions did you emit, and how many tons will you emit next year, directly and increasingly indirectly. So now, this is to your point of how do these things impact the small business? You'll largely be collateral, not in support. So the big company has to account for its supply chain. You're small in the supply chain. They will turn to you and say, we need data about what you do, because what we buy from you constitutes a significant percentage of our turnover. Maybe not you individually, but you and others like you in aggregate represent 20% of our activity. Therefore, our investors are saying, if you're spending 20% of your cost of goods on something from a bunch of small entities, we want to know if they were operating consistent with the principles we expect from you. So now, in the best of cases, and I've done a lot of work over the years with companies like Walmart and IKEA and Unilever and so on, the supply chain organization, and there's an organization called the Institute for Supply Management that is an organization of supply chain managers, will formulate a strategy that says, wow, our supply chain partners are really ill-equipped to do this without our help. So we can't just put our boot on their throat and demand that they start incurring costs to do the accounting, to do the measurement, to do the reporting. How can we help them? So they might say, we're going to give you fair warning. We're going to be held to this commitment. We have made this commitment. We will be held accountable for it, and we will also be held accountable for the aspects and impacts of our supply chain. So we're giving you fair warning. This is what we're going to be reporting. And we're going to give preference and support to our small supply chain partners who are interested in being leaders, who would like to step to the head of the line and say, help me, I'll do it. And in some cases, that's technical support. In other cases, they may actually provide financial support, low interest loans, grants, advisory, consulting services to their supply chain partners who say, I want to do this, even though I'm not required by law, even though I'm not a big publicly traded company. Right. So that's one.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
That's one.
I will keep a thought in my brain.
And then in the second year, they might say, okay, now instead of just saying, this is important, it's coming, we're going to start giving preference to those suppliers who act on it. And in the case of Walmart, they would say, if you want end cap position, if you want eye level position in our stores, it's going to go to the companies that step to the head of line and start adopting our sustainability initiatives for the smaller suppliers to comply. So then it's not a stick, it's a carrot, right? So it goes from fair warning, we're going to do this, to now we're going to give you some carrots, come and do it. But then generally down the road, they'll say, if you haven't gotten it by year 3, if you're not doing it by year 5, and you're not benchmark in terms of how it's done, then we're going to start using the stick, and it's likely you will be excluded from our supply chain. In the same way I discussed this concept of quantitative inclusive screening, it's going to be like, well, yeah, we won't rule you out, but you're not likely to be ruled in at the top of the class. You won't get NCAP, you won't get eye level, and you won't get our support.
Well, let's talk about 3 economic juggernauts on the retail side, if we can. So these are points of distribution, right? And one of them, they're all, Goliaths in the room. So, we have the combination of Amazon and Whole Foods. And one of the things Whole Foods did a couple of years ago is they said, you got to be organically certified, right?
Sure.
And if you're not, or we're going to give preference to companies that are organically certified if you want to do these things. And for many small chocolate makers, finding space in the shelf in Whole Foods, whether locally or regionally or nationally, represents sort of the holy grail in terms of massive distribution for product. You then have two others, Walmart, which you mentioned, the largest business in the world, and certainly one of the certainly
I
the
think
largest.
The thing that I was impressed with is because I had chances to sit down with one of the former CEOs, Lee Scott, and when I asked him about sustainability and communications and advertising, his comment was, "Don, but we only spend $450 million a year on advertising, only, but we generate over $1 billion in revenue a day. So if I put my priority on that, I'd be held to account from a fiduciary perspective." And so you need to talk to the companies that provide us with product, like Unilever, who, while they say they spend $7 billion a year at the time on advertising. I did meet with them ultimately, and their approach was similar, kind of, well, but we only spend $7 billion on advertising. But
Only.
Guess why context matters? Because together brands annually spend over $1 trillion on advertising. What's the environmental, social, and financial impact of $1 trillion of GDP? By and large, that's escaped scrutiny from an ESG reporting perspective. However, there's lots of communication about how we've eliminated plastic knives, forks, and dishes on the production set of our commercials, or we recycle all of the waste from our productions, or some other effort to say, well, at the margins we're doing something, but we're still relying on fossil fuels, or we're still relying on the data centers where the things that we're streaming to you are hosted are still deriving power from non-renewable resources.
Right. So, even though it's a very small thing, one of the things that I did starting this month was, my payment processor has the ability to capture a certain percentage of the gross revenues that I get and then put them into a fund which is focused on carbon capture projects.
Yeah, some of that is use. Those are things we can do. I mean, individually, there are things we can do that make things better.
My feeling is that again, I'm sitting here on a computer. It's a brand new computer, right? And it got to me, and this is being streamed, to 3 different platforms, and all the, so there is a cloud-based component to this, and there is a carbon impact associated with all of these things.
All
so
media,
I have a responsibility locally. I do all the recycling, everything that New York City says that I should be able to do, irrespective of what they do with it. I don't have a whole lot of impact associated with it. They just started composting here, and so I think I'm going to sign up for composting, because it got closed down because of COVID. But there is this very, very interesting tension, I think, which is embedded into what I say matters to me, and what I'm willing to pay for. And I think that when we talk about sustainability,
there's no tension. I can tell you from the research.
There's no tension.
I can tell you from the research. I mean, look, I do consumer research and business research as a living, large studies. And I think when in the work I was doing with Walmart, Walmart said for consumers generally, I will not. It varies based on age cohort. It varies based on geography. Generally, it is not a primary factor in their purchase decision.
It being sustainability?
Sustainability, yeah.
Okay.
Now, for some it is, but it's at the margins when you look at it in the broad perspective. And so Walmart came to the conclusion, well, people shouldn't have to pay more for a sustainable product. That was an important notion. You talked about ethical sourcing earlier. Ethical investing actually was the precursor to sustainable investing, going from ethical screens that were qualitative in nature. I'm going to exclude this because it's bad in some qualitative manner.
It's important to me as an investor.
To quantitative inclusive screening, which said, I'm still going to sell products from Clorox, but I'm going to pick the products from Clorox that embody life cycle principles that are based on less toxic, renewable resources, for example. So it was articulated in one of the mentors I've had over the years was John Elkington, the author of a book that is really the basis for this concept of the triple bottom line. The book was called Cannibals with Forks. And the question asked is based on a poem by Stanislav Lech, which asked the question, is a cannibal that uses a fork and knife a better cannibal? It was this argument about, is sustainable investing, if it's not perfect, better than the alternatives that don't even take those aspects of the business into consideration? And at the time, triple bottom line accounting was an effort to say, yeah, it is. It's not perfect. It's better. The criticism would often come from the more how can I put it? The argument that, yeah, but you're just making things less bad. And until recently, the sense of the existential threat, the irreversible threshold, the point of no return being within our lifetimes, not our children's lifetimes, not our grandchildren's lifetime, but in our lifetimes, or at present, we may have already crossed the threshold in some cases, has changed the sense of urgency, that it is necessary to mobilize massive amounts of private capital now, not in 10 years, not in 20 years, now at scale. Or frankly, the dystopian views of some of my friends and favorite authors will wind up being, unfortunately, more real than we like.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. And, that seems like both a sort of slightly macabre, but I think a perfect place to end.
It's real.
Again, yes, you're absolutely right. It's a very, very real place to go to.
Yeah, it's where we are.
And so what I want to do is I want to thank everybody who watched, people who contributed a comment. But what I also want to say, Don, is I found this fascinating. I always love talking with you. I always learn something.
Thanks. Likewise.
You and I share a history that goes back to the mid 1980s.
Yeah,
in color electronic prepress and electronic publishing systems, and we've connected and reconnected at very different parts of our lives. And so what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask you to return.
I'd love to.
I want to focus about this notion of advertising and communications, because one of the other hats you wore this thing called the Institute for Sustainable Communications. And I think that's when we talk about cocoa and chocolate, that effective storytelling, right, is a really, really important thing. And also this notion of packaging. So there's a really, really important things about, printing and substrates and all sorts of other things, which I think
this notion of extended producer responsibility, which is a big concern to companies now who are told you no longer live in a make, take, and waste society. You have to be responsible for the end of life fate of the packaging that you put your product in.
Okay. So we want to move from make, take, and waste to make, take, and I don't
to a world where there is no waste. Waste is food.
Okay.
To kind of quote James McDonough, and this notion that there are two cycles. One, there's the biological nutrient cycle, and then there's the technical nutrient cycle. So uranium is not exactly a biological nutrient. So there may be some extremophiles who can do something with it, but there may be some. But the goal is to say, how do we take a waste, what would previously be thought of as a waste product, and how do we valorize that? How do we upcycle it? How do we repurpose it? How do we preserve it, rather than having to go back and extract more of the raw material from which, or energy from which that was made?
Right.
But in the Western world and in the US in particular, we've often built systems that have incredible inertia that are predicated on a make, take, and waste economy, where the externalities don't appear on the balance sheet, where and to change that requires changing minds, and that's where the power of narrative comes in. That's where the ESG reporting, which is largely quantitative, needs to be complemented by consistent but aligned communication that's more limbic and narrative in nature, that ultimately satisfies our need as a species for compelling narratives and stories.
So in talking about that, I mean, a lot of these things, most people they're abstract. I mean, there is no visceral connection that they can make. And so the challenge is not only writing about these things, but writing about things in a way that get people to care. Right. And certainly why should I care about this? What is it about this? And connecting it to some sort of personal feeling is one of the things that I try for. I mean, I cover highly complicated technical subjects, but in the end you have to relate to it as a person.
For me, I think my connection with chocolate is really crystallized when I took a trip to Belize and spent a day among chocolate trees and seeing the process of not only drying the cocoa beans, but then making my own chocolate with an ancient method, which I'm sure all the terms for. And okay, so I made 2 absolutely miserable bars of chocolate, but it did.
But they were the best miserable bars.
Yeah, but it made it real for me. It's kind of like people who do wallpaper in their own bathroom. It looks good to them. But now I appreciate it in a different way. I think that's important.
Great. I want to jump in really quickly. I want to thank Mark and Yuri at Blue Spruce for their conversation. Thank you, guys. I'm glad that you were able to hear today and watch this. Extended producer responsibility is, certainly something we're going to see. It's important. And also this notion of, the fact that, you're having access to this kind of information, right, has an active impact on who you choose to do business with, I think is really, really important. And then finally, not finally, but I also want to say thank you to Lisa Wellman. Hey, Lisa, thank you. Don mentioned your name earlier this morning, and we had a conversation.
Senator Lisa Wellman, by the way.
And from Washington State, as I understand. And we've had this conversation. You've had this conversation with Don over the 15 years. Over the past 15 years or so. And these are conversations that I am very seriously considering actually engaging in, Don, with over the course of the next year.
And to Lisa's point, there's still a lot of, as Greta Thunberg would say, blah, blah, blah.
Right.
And we need more action. It needs to be action, not only now, but at scale. And I think it applies. Cocoa and chocolate may play an important role in making that kind of emotional or limbic connection to people. But then we still got to do the work at scale. Well,
I am certainly hoping that what we could do is we could use chocolate as the point of the spear. Right. Within Washington State, there are some very influential small chocolate makers within the community. And perhaps this is an opportunity to engage with them in a broader context. And what I want to let everybody know here is that Don and I have been talking about putting together a sort of a regular program of coaching and other kinds of access to resources so that people who are really, really interested in understanding what ESG reporting is, what sustainability reporting it is, how to make it an active part of what it is that they do, what it comes from, sourcing, communications, packaging, whatever it is that means. And that's something that we're going to be talking about over the course of the next couple of weeks and months, and hope to engage, many of you, who can't afford, $1,000 an hour consultant to doing these things, would be able to have access to this kind of information and background.
And even conducting research. I mean, Clay and I have talked about, some of you may not be able to afford primary research, but collectively bringing it to a larger group is another possibility. So we look forward to working on these things together.
Great. Right. And so one quick shout out to, again, Josh Parker in Idaho. Josh, thank you very much for checking in today. And I'm glad you enjoyed the conversation. And with that, I want to say thank you to everybody. We'll be back next Friday and every Friday on the Chocolate Life Live with topics which talk about politics and economics and things which don't directly relate to cocoa sourcing and chocolate making. But beginning in February, I'm going to start a Tuesday series, which is going to focus on chocolate makers and cocoa suppliers and that part of the business, and continue with the Friday series, which is going to focus on the larger topics which have an impact in the industry. And at this point, what I want to say is thank you to everybody who is here today. Thank you to Don. I really appreciate the conversation. Again, I say every time we have this conversation, I learn a whole lot more. And I wish everybody a safe, healthy, and sane New Year's Eve and New Year's Day. And I have to say that 2020 and 2021 sucked in some really, really major ways. And just mildly speaking, they sucked in many, many ways. And I think that surviving is certainly, some of us thrived, but many of us, surviving was the major challenge. And I'm looking forward to working to make 2022 definitely not sucky, and a place where we can not just survive, but thrive.
I second that motion.
Yeah. Again, Don, thank you very much. And
thanks, Clay.
We look forward
and
to
thank everybody. Please post your questions. Clay and I look forward to responding, even if it's not right here, right now.
So again, if you post your comments in the LinkedIn feed or in the Facebook on the Chocolate Life or on the YouTube feed, we will be able to see them. And also, if you go to TheChocolateLife.com, you will find a post for today's live stream. It's called the Chocolate Life Live ESG and Sustainability Reporting. If you are a member of the Chocolate Life, you can go down to the bottom and add a comment down there, a question. We'll be able to respond to it there as well. And with that, everybody, right, thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.